Here's a question that should bother you more than it probably does. What if everything you think you know about where you come from is completely wrong? Not slightly off, not a little exaggerated, completely, fundamentally wrong. Because scientists have now done something extraordinary. They've taken the DNA of thousands of people buried across Britain over thousands of years, decoded it, mapped it, and compared it to the DNA of people living in Britain today. And what they found doesn't just challenge the history books. It rewrites them. The results were so surprising that the researchers themselves struggled to explain what they were seeing. Ancient kingdoms that collapsed 15 centuries ago are still visible in the genetic makeup of modern communities. An empire that ruled for 400 years left almost zero biological trace. And the group that most deeply shaped the DNA of the modern British Isles. Most people have literally never heard of them. Now, before we get into any of that, let's start where every good story starts. At the very beginning, long before Rome, long before the Saxons, long before anyone called this island Britain. Around 6,000 years ago, the people who were about to transform this land forever began arriving on its shores. They didn't come from Britain. They came from what is now modern Turkey. These were Neolithic farmers, part of a slow agricultural revolution that had been rolling westward across Europe for generations. And when they arrived, they didn't politely introduce themselves to the people already living there. The original inhabitants of Britain were hunter-gatherers, people whose ancestors had walked onto the island after the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age. And for thousands of years, it had been their home. But the farmers had a powerful advantage: food security. More crops meant more children meant more villages, and more villages meant slow, unstoppable expansion. The hunter-gatherers didn't lose in a single battle. They just faded, displaced, absorbed, and eventually almost entirely gone. And those original Britons? The ones who were there first? In 2018, scientists at the Natural History Museum in London extracted DNA from Britain's oldest complete human skeleton. A man who had died roughly 10,000 years ago, found in a cave in Somerset. They called him Cheddar Man. And the results of that DNA analysis genuinely stunned the world. Dr. Tom Booth, a researcher at the museum, described what they found. Cheddar Man had dark to black skin, with blue or green eyes and dark brown hair. The very first British person looked absolutely nothing like the population that lives there today. That image of the pale, fair-haired native Briton, it didn't come from the beginning of the story. It came much, much later. And the people who replaced the hunter-gatherers, those Neolithic farmers who cleared the forests, planted the crops, and built vast stone monuments across the island, they had olive brown skin and dark features too. They were the ones who constructed the first phases of Stonehenge. They aligned those massive stones with the winter solstice. They buried their dead with extraordinary care. For over 1,000 years, they were the people of Britain. And then something arrived from the east that erased nearly everything they were. Now, this is where the story gets genuinely jaw-dropping. Around 2,500 years before the birth of Christ, a new group of people began moving into Britain from Central Europe. They're called the Bell Beaker people, named for their distinctive pottery shaped like upside-down bells. But their roots stretched even further east, all the way to the vast grasslands of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. They were descended from nomadic herders known as the Yamnaya, horse riders, metal workers, people who had already swept across continental Europe and rewritten its genetic story. In February 2018, a landmark study was published in the journal Nature, the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted at that point. A team of 144 researchers analyzed 400 prehistoric skeletons from across Europe, and what they found in Britain was devastating. Professor Ian Barnes, one of the study's senior authors, reported that skeletal remains from Britain shortly after this period showed a dramatically different DNA profile from those who came before. The estimate? At least 90% of Britain's genetic ancestry was replaced. 90%. Think about that for a second. Not 10%, not half. 9 out of every 10 genetic lineages that had existed in Britain were essentially gone. And the timing made it even more haunting. The researchers discovered that the Bell Beaker people arrived in Britain just after the final major stones at Stonehenge were erected. The people who finished that monument were almost entirely different from the people who started it. The Neolithic farmers built it. A completely different population completed it. And the Bell Beaker arrivals also changed what the British looked like. They carried genes for lighter skin, blue eyes, and lighter hair. Those features we associate with the modern British population today, they didn't come from the Romans. They didn't come from the Saxons. They came from these Bronze Age steppe migrants. 4,500 years ago. This is the deep genetic foundation of Britain. A bedrock so ancient and so firmly established that by the time Julius Caesar even glanced toward the English Channel, it had already been in place for 3,000 years, which is your first major clue for understanding what happened, or rather, what didn't happen when Rome arrived. Rome occupied Britain for nearly 400 years. Nearly 400 years. That's longer than the United States has existed as a nation. They built London. They built Bath. They built York. They paved 10,000 miles of roads across the island. At its peak, their garrison numbered around 55,000 soldiers stationed in forts from Hadrian's Wall to the White Cliffs of Dover. Including families and dependents, an estimated 125,000 people connected to the empire lived on British soil. And yet, when geneticists decoded the DNA of modern British people, they found something that should have been impossible. Almost no Roman genetic signature. Anywhere. Not in London. Not in York. Not in Bath. Not in any of the towns Rome built from nothing. The most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen ruled this island for 4 centuries and left virtually no trace in the blood of its people. How does that happen? Here's how. Rome never actually colonized Britain in any meaningful demographic sense. There were no waves of Roman families pouring across the channel to settle the countryside. The garrison, impressive as it sounds, represented roughly 3% of the native British population. A thin military crust over a vast sea of local people. And those soldiers? By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, more than 70% of the garrison was made up of auxiliary units, non-citizens recruited from across the empire. The troops stationed in Britain came from Gaul, from Spain, from Syria, from Romania, from North Africa. A soldier buried in York might carry Middle Eastern ancestry. The letters found near Hadrian's Wall, the famous Vindolanda tablets, revealed troops from what is now Belgium writing home in their own local language, not classical Latin. In 2016, researchers examined Roman-era skeletons from York. Of 7 genomes analyzed, 6 showed genetic profiles closely matching modern Welsh and Celtic populations. They were native Britons, not Mediterranean immigrants. And a 2024 study examining dozens of late Iron Age and Roman-era genomes from rural Cambridgeshire found the same thing. The title of that paper said it plainly: Low Genetic Impact of the Roman Occupation of Britain in Rural Communities. Rome gave Britain its roads, its cities, its legal traditions, but it never gave Britain its blood. Then in 410 AD, Rome did something no one in Britain expected. It left. Emperor Honorius reportedly sent a letter to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defenses. The legions withdrew. The imperial administration dissolved. And within a single generation, 4 centuries of Roman infrastructure began to crumble. Roofs caved in. Coins stopped circulating. Aqueducts cracked and ran dry. Towns that had bustled with commerce went silent. Britain plunged into one of the most poorly documented centuries in all of European history. And from across the North Sea, new peoples began to arrive. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, from the coastal lowlands of what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Historians had debated for over a century what really happened during this period. Was it a violent invasion, a cultural takeover by a small elite, or something else entirely? In September 2022, the answer arrived. A study published in Nature, the largest early medieval genetic study ever conducted, analyzed nearly 500 ancient genomes from across northwestern Europe. The results for England were staggering. In early medieval Eastern and Southern England, approximately 76% of genetic ancestry came from continental Northern Europe, from what is today northern Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. 76%. Lead researcher Joshua Gretzinger stated that some Anglo-Saxon sites looked almost entirely continental European, the only explanation being a massive movement of people from the North Sea zone. But here's the crucial detail. This wasn't just warriors. Dr. Maria Prelado, who analyzed the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic line passed through mothers, demonstrated that the immigrants were made up as much by women as by men. Entire families, whole communities relocating. Archaeologist Duncan Sayer put it simply. He suspected families, or even small villages, simply got up and moved. The Celtic Britons, the people whose DNA had survived 400 years of Roman occupation completely intact, were now being displaced, absorbed, and pushed to the margins. The Anglo-Saxons achieved in 2 or 3 centuries what Rome could not achieve in 4. They didn't just change the culture. They changed the blood. But they didn't change everyone. In the mountains, in the rain, in the wild western fringes of the island, the old blood held. And it's still there today. The 2022 Nature study confirmed it plainly. Most present-day Scottish, Welsh, and Irish genomes showed ancestry from the Bronze Age and Iron Age populations of the British Isles, with little or no later continental contribution. In Wales, in Cornwall, in the Scottish Highlands, the ancient British DNA, that deep bell beaker and Bronze Age lineage, survived. Not because these people fought harder than the Britons in the East, but because the land itself protected them. Mountains, moors, rough terrain, river valleys that slowed expansion to a crawl. Geography became a genetic fortress. And here's the bitter irony that echoes all the way to the present day. The word Wales comes from the Anglo-Saxon word meaning foreigner or stranger. The original inhabitants of Britain were called foreigners in their own land by the newcomers who had replaced them in the East. A study published in Nature in 2015 by a team at the University of Oxford proved this with extraordinary precision. When researchers analyzed over 2,000 DNA samples from rural Britain, the Welsh emerged as the most genetically distinct population on the British mainland. Their DNA connects them not to Saxon England, not to Norman France, not to Roman Italy, but to the people who lived on this island thousands of years before any of those cultures existed. Now, what about the Vikings? Because in 865 AD, dragon-proud ships appeared on the horizon. The great heathen army landed in East Anglia, and within years the Norse and Danish warriors had torn through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and carved out a vast territory across northern and eastern England. York became Jorvik, a thriving Viking capital. Norse settlers poured into the Scottish Islands, the Irish coast, and deep into the English heartland. For 2 centuries, Scandinavian power reshaped the political map of Britain. So their DNA must be everywhere in the modern population, right? Well, here's where the story pulls another surprise. When the Oxford team analyzed the DNA of modern English people, Professor Peter Donnelly noted they could see no clear genetic evidence of the Danish Viking occupation. Despite over a century of political dominance across half of England, the Danish Vikings left no distinct genetic cluster in the modern population. The largest Viking DNA study ever conducted, published in 2020, sequencing the genomes of 442 Viking-era individuals, concluded that up to 6% of the UK population carries Viking ancestry. Real, but modest. A faint echo compared to the Anglo-Saxon transformation, except in one place, Orkney, the islands off the far northern tip of Scotland. There, the population carries approximately 25% Norwegian Viking ancestry. But even there, 75% of the DNA was indigenous. The Norse intermarried heavily with the existing population rather than replacing it. And then came 1066, the event every British person knows. William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel, defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and seized total control of the country. The Normans, themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France, replaced the entire English aristocracy. They imposed Norman French as the language of power. They built stone castles across the kingdom. They reshaped English law, English society, English identity from the top down. The Norman conquest changed everything about England. Everything, that is, except its blood. William brought perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 followers into a country of 1.5 to 2 million people. Norman settlers may have eventually made up no more than 5% of the total population. It was an elite takeover, not a demographic one. The event that gave England feudalism, half its vocabulary, its cathedrals, and a class system that would define it for 1,000 years, genetically negligible. The Anglo-Saxon migration, the one most people outside of academia barely think about, remains the single largest genetic transformation in Britain since the Bronze Age. But here's the part of this story that I find most extraordinary. Every empire that conquered Britain brought its armies and its administrators. And then, eventually, it left. But the women who were already there when those armies arrived, they outlasted every single one of them. Mitochondrial DNA, the genetic information passed only from mother to child, generation after generation, tells a fundamentally quieter story than the rest of the genome. While the broader genetic picture shows dramatic upheavals with each wave of migration, the maternal line reveals something more resilient. At some Anglo-Saxon sites, migrants and native Britons lived side by side from the very beginning. At others, the two communities buried their dead with completely different traditions. But over centuries, intermarriage happened everywhere. And here's what makes this profound. While early medieval English populations were roughly 76% continental in ancestry, modern English people are only about 40% Anglo-Saxon. The proportion dropped over centuries. The native British contribution, that ancient bell beaker and Bronze Age lineage, slowly recovered through intermarriage and demographic rebound. The old blood reasserted itself. Every conquest was also a marriage. Anglo-Saxon men who settled in Britain took local British wives. Their children spoke the father's language, carried the father's cultural identity, but also carried the mother's ancient lineage forward. The Viking settlers did the same. Even during the Roman period, soldiers stationed at the frontier married local women. When Rome withdrew, those families didn't leave. They stayed. They blended. And within a generation, they were British. This is the hidden architecture of British genetic history. The conquest you read about in textbooks, the dramatic battles, the burning towns, the new kings, they're the surface layer. Underneath, a quieter process was always running. The mothers endured. The mothers blended. The mothers carried the old world into the new one, cell by cell, generation by generation. And that process left marks so precise that when scientists finally had the tools to read them, what appeared on the map left everyone speechless. The people of the British Isles Project, led by researchers at the University of Oxford, spent over a decade collecting blood samples from more than 4,000 volunteers across rural Britain. Each volunteer had to have all 4 grandparents born within 80 kilometers of each other. That was the key. Because each person's DNA is a mixture of their 4 grandparents, the researchers were effectively sampling the genetic landscape of Britain as it existed in the late 19th century, before the mass population movements of the modern era. Using advanced statistical analysis, the team sorted over 2,000 samples into genetic clusters based purely on DNA similarity, with no information about where anyone lived. Then they plotted the results onto a map. Sir Walter Bodmer, the project's lead, described what happened next. They were, in his words, absolutely astonished. 17 genetic clusters. And when historians looked at those clusters alongside old maps, the correspondence was eerie. The genetic boundaries of modern British people aligned with the political boundaries of Anglo-Saxon England. Ancient kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Kent, kingdoms drawn by warlords in the 6th century, were still visible in the DNA of people living in those same regions today. 1,500 years after those kingdoms collapsed, Devon and Cornwall split into separate genetic clusters. North Wales and South Wales divided along the borders of ancient kingdoms. The split in Northern Ireland mapped onto territories that had existed around 600 AD. People haven't moved as much as anyone assumed. The wars, the treaties, the rivers and forests that once divided tribal lands left marks not on any map you can find in a library, but in DNA passed silently through 100 generations. We carry the borders of dead kingdoms in our cells. And one final detail. The people of the British Isles study found no distinct Roman genetic cluster anywhere in Britain. Not one. 400 years of occupation. 0 identifiable genetic community surviving in any region of the island. While Anglo-Saxon genetic signatures from a migration lasting perhaps 200 years remain sharp enough to map onto a kingdom-by-kingdom grid 15 centuries later. So what does all of this mean? Britain's genetic story is a template for how identity actually works. It tells us that the histories nations build about themselves, the heroes they claim, the ancestors they celebrate, the origins they point to, are almost never the same as the biological reality running through their veins. The British thought they were Roman. They weren't. They claimed a single Celtic heritage. But the science proved there is no single Celtic genetic group. The Welsh, the Cornish, the Scots, and the Irish are among the most genetically different populations from each other in the entire United Kingdom. What the British are, in overwhelming genetic proportion, are the descendants of two groups most people have never heard of. Bell beaker migrants from the Eurasian steppe who arrived 4,500 years ago and replaced 90% of the island's population. And Anglo-Saxon farming families from northern Germany and Denmark who arrived 1,500 years ago and reshaped the east of England just as dramatically. Everything in between, Rome, the Vikings, the Normans, left their culture, their language, their architecture, their laws, but not their blood, not in any quantity that moved the needle. And here's the thing, the story is still being written. Researchers have identified that 20 to 40% of modern English ancestry comes from a population genetically similar to Iron Age France. But they still cannot say with certainty when this ancestry arrived or through which migration events. Senior author Stefan Schiffel stated directly that future work targeting the medieval period will be needed to understand this signal. 20 to 40% of an entire nation's ancestry still unexplained, still waiting for the right graves to be opened, the right bones to be tested, the right genomes to be read. Somewhere in Britain right now, there is a person whose mitochondrial DNA traces an unbroken maternal line back more than 10,000 years. Back to one of the first humans who ever walked onto this island after the glaciers retreated. That lineage survived the Neolithic farmers, survived the Bell beaker wipeout, survived the Romans, the Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, the Black Death, and 2 world wars. It's in every cell of that person's body, and they have absolutely no idea. The ancestors we've forgotten are waiting to be found. And if this kind of deep history, the kind that rewrites everything you thought you knew, is something you want more of, then stick around. Because the next chapter of this story might be the most surprising one yet. Like this video, share it with someone whose mind deserves to be blown, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next.